Take this seat.
I'll take the end, make a Stephen sandwich.
There you go. That works.
Don't mess with the sandwich, man. Are you messing with the sandwich?
I'm going to
This is
sit in the
open?
middle to keep things
Never mind.
at even keel here.
All right. Wow, actually, it was much easier when I was standing up before. The light is blinding right now. So as Jim said, I'm Stephen O'Grady. Some of you may have seen me talk this morning. As an analyst firm, again, most of you are familiar with what we do. This is the topic of this particular panel is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out, containers, platforms, VMs, how do all these things fit together? What do these changes mean? And to help answer that question, we obviously have a very talented panel. So rather than me sort of fumble with their bios, I'll just start with Sam. And if the panelists could introduce themselves and try to keep it reasonably brief.
Sam Ramji, I'm the CEO of the Foundry Foundation, and previously I was Chief Strategy Officer at Apogee for the last 5.5 years. Last time I got to present in front of this august group, I was in fact head of open source and Linux at Microsoft Corporation, and before that a nerd and programmer since I was about 9 years old. So that's my story.
You brought him over.
Jim ultimately won that particular wrestling match.
All right, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Stephen. My name is Lauren Cooney. I run software strategy for the CTO office at Cisco. My background's a little bit different than most people at Cisco in that I actually, I worked with Sam at Microsoft, bringing a lot of open source into the web stack there, ran web platform and standards. Before that, I was at IBM, where I worked around big data and built the first API platform to market out of the information management group. And prior to that, I was at BEA Systems, doing a lot of things around WebLogic and looking at how people consume technology and build technology and where they want to go and what they want to consume.
Got it down the line.
So my name is Craig McLuckie. I'm a product guy at Google. I'm responsible for our cloud computing product portfolio. So Compute Engine, App Engine, and the emerging Container Engine portfolio. I was the founder of the Kubernetes project, one of the founders of the Kubernetes project, which brings Google-style orchestration to the Linux application container world. Prior to that, I grew up at Microsoft.
That's good.
Like everyone else?
Steve, I never worked at Microsoft. Thank you. I'm going to drop the mic now and just walk off the stage.
Finish strong, Steve.
Steve Pousty. I work at Red Hat on OpenShift, which is Red Hat's platform as a service. I'm officially a PaaS dust spreader. That's what I got the name I wanted to put on my business card. What that means is I'm a developer advocate. And so I build apps and talk to developers most of the time. Two caveats. I usually play the saucy person on the panel. I'm getting kind of tired of that role because then everybody argues with me and I'm just not feeling up to it, but I may still go saucy. And if I go saucy, that means I'm arguing just so that we have a fun panel, not necessarily because I strongly believe it, so don't hunt me down later. And second, I'm from New York, so if I use the word guys, it's not a gender-specific term. Guys is gender neutral, so please don't take offense at the use of the word guys.
I think that's probably the first qualification I've ever had from a panelist in terms of using gendered pronouns. But all right, moving right along.
It's a good start.
I actually really don't care where we start with this question, but one of the questions that we get all the time as analysts is pretty simple. Obviously, PaaS has evolved to offer, essentially a set of platform services, depending on how you define that, on top of, some infrastructure substrate. Containers have made a huge jump. Certainly in the last 12 to 18 months, we like to tell people, we've been doing this at RedMonk, since 2002, and Docker in particular is one of the fastest growing projects we've ever seen from a visibility standpoint. So how do these things fit together? How do they not? I mean, are they competitive? Do they overlap? And having said that I wasn't going to start anywhere, I guess I'll start with Sam.
It's funny because nothing's particularly perfectly linear anymore. It's almost more like concentric circles. What is Linux? What's a container? What is metadata? How does it all stack up, right? But I think ultimately it's about projecting user space across the data center. A lot of data center technologies exist that make it easier to render the data center as APIs, to be able to work with all the different resources, different instantiations. But your typical app developer does not and never wants to understand those. They want to be able to place, basically say, as we all learned, git push Heroku master, right? You just want to be able to say, here's my code. Please operate it within an SLA that's going to make everybody happy. And the less details I need to know about that, the better. So I think the focus that Cloud Foundry is taking is, can we have a massively distributed ecosystem where we've got consistency and a lot of app developers both building core apps within enterprises, bespoke applications, and can we create a really powerful ISV, independent software vendor marketplace where, companies like Sugar CRM or Documentum or brand new companies are building small apps for the enterprise that enables us to have an internet-like experience in the enterprise. If you work in a large company today, you can't imagine the misery that you experience with internal apps compared to the delight of being an average user, not even a super user on the internet.
Yeah.
So how do we take PaaS, platforms, containers, how do we take all this app developer-centric stuff and say, here's user space for the data center, have fun, and make money? If we do that, then I think all of us win.
Okay, fair enough. Docker, Rocket, I guess we should include, containers versus PaaS, thoughts, anybody else?
I don't think it's containers versus PaaS. I actually see containers as a component that can work inside of a PaaS environment, but containers can also work inside of, for example, an infrastructure as a service environment, right? So a lot of what sometimes we look at is we're building out new network services that are virtualized, right? How do we containerize those so that they can run across multiple VMs, for example, right? So they're not dependent upon one VM or another VM. Things along those lines. So I don't see them as competing. I see them as actually complementary in certain situations. But I also see them as growing extremely fast. Docker, you mentioned, is not only growing, but also being used inside of other projects like Shippable and stuff like that. And I think that's really important to look at.
Yeah, I'd agree. I tend to think I think these things are very neatly aligned. And I think what Docker's really given us is a very elegant way to solve a packaging and deployment problem that's existed since forever. And I think it's catching on like wildfire because it's created this incredibly powerful, hermetically sealed atom of deployment. So it solved one of several problems that PaaS was looking to address, and it solved it incredibly well. I think if you look more broadly, there's still a lot of things that you need to run a modern enlightened application. You need a cluster environment, so you need a place where you can deploy this thing and have its lifecycle managed and have it wired into a broader system. You're going to need a set of common services, the things that bring an operationally viable environment to you, so you can log and monitor and deal with it. And then there's the final piece to this, which I think we haven't seen as much sort of immediate traction on, but I think it's going to be really important, which is the actual sort of application environment, the curated pieces, the dependency management, the package management pieces that your code depends on. And I think if you pull that whole thing together, that represents the promise that PaaS has had. But what we're starting to see is a very principled decomposition of PaaS into these constituent pieces along very sort of effective interface lines. And I think it's letting us actually produce much richer and much more sophisticated, better systems.
Yeah, and I'm supposed to say something original and exciting after all three of these people spoke. And
You choose to set on the
I know, I did. Well, I hope we switch the order next time. I mean, they all said the same things I was going to say, but they said them first. I think the only thing that I would say is, I think almost all the PaaSes that I know have been using containers to start with. It just wasn't Docker. And so like you said, the great part about Docker was it was a nice specification that we could all come to agree on, and kudos to them also for making that a very open process, right? They could have said, here's the Docker container spec, and we're going to control, or, I mean, they're having some issues with control around it, but they've made it a pretty open spec that people could sign on.
Yep.
So,
But the thing they've nailed is the developer experience. I mean, let's just call it what it is. Docker's put lightning in a bottle in terms of creating an amazing developer experience that gets you up and running on the container.
okay, so that I can disagree with you on. So I think what they, finally something to disagree about. I think actually what Docker has benefited from and containers in general have benefited from is VMs, right? I saw most of the people in the audience, and most of you are at least my age or around my age. And when you were growing up writing developer software, when you were developing software, it's like, I need a box. Don't you put any VM on my machine. I don't want you cohabitating other things on my machine. There was a lot of cultural resistance to VMs. And I think what's happened is the VMs were the icebreaker for containers. People got used to running on virtualized hardware. And so what containers are, because of that, containers are now able to say, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to run multi-tenant on that machine, and you can be okay. People are like, oh, okay, that sounds great. Oh, and you're going to be lighter weight than a VM? Awesome. I'm all about containers now. As a developer, I was actually not very excited about Docker, just to be honest. But that's because I'd used a PaaS before, because to me, a container is no more than a VM, just with better specifications and lighter weight, right? From a developer experience. From a sysadmin experience and other experiences, I agree it brings a lot of other things, but as a developer...
Well, the instantiation time, I mean, there are definitely differences.
But how often do you instantiate a VM as a developer?
Yeah, that's
Once
true.
a day, right? You boot your machine, you boot your VM, and off you go. It doesn't, I still had to like manage I still have to manage the container, right? Like I still have to install the software into the container. I have to still start it up.
Not entirely. I mean, Docker pull gives me a really rich sort of baseline of containers to work from, right? They might be curated.
So I might have a curated level of VMs that all look, AMIs are VMs. And there's a very rich ecosystem of AMIs that have a ton of stuff. I can pull down an AMI with almost everything I want in it and go.
You can, but it's all bound to a specific provider. So if you want to run your AMI on your local desktop, God help you.
Okay, I agree but my point is, a VM can be, my IT department could make a set of VMs, blessed VMs with all the software I needed, and I boot it up once for the day. To me, as a developer, containers don't get me much, except when they're put with things that make them more exciting. Like I actually find, shocker, as the guy who works on Red Hat's PaaS, a PaaS a lot more exciting because I give one command and I've got my whole environment, right? And I can deploy to the cloud. I don't have to worry about all that other stuff. And whether it's Cloud Foundry, whether it's ours, whether it's Heroku, that was the exciting thing as a developer. A container, but the one thing though.
Wait. Let's come back to
Wait,
that.
hold on. Wait, I gotta give one thing back to containers. And I think this is the part where we're all kind of pushing right now. And I'm really hoping this comes with our next version of OpenShift. Is I can take my same containers that I'm running on my machine, dev there, and then push that straight to the cloud and have that work. So I have a seamless desktop. I think the thing that all of us have missed, all of us, including Heroku, who's probably done the best job so far, is a seamless desktop to cloud deployment. And I hope containers solve that.
Well, we'll come back to that. One of the questions I wanted to actually start with Lauren on to get the perspective, particularly from somebody who's coming at it from a systems perspective, is, has this changed sort of our fundamental notion of what the atomic unit of computing is, right? So to your point, Steve, in other words, one of the things that, I've talked about, lots of people have talked about this before, is for most of us coming up, the atomic unit was a server. If I wanted to build something, if I wanted to run a database, something, I needed a server to base this on. VMs were sort of the next step. Hey, I have this sort of interim virtual sort of representation of this. Containers are not, sort of the quantum leap that necessarily that VMs were, but obviously introduced some changes in terms of weight, speed, shared infrastructure, and so on. So to Lauren, and we'll come back to the rest of the panelists, when you look at it from a systems perspective, have containers in particular changed the way that you view, what is sort of the most basic, component of how we put together an application?
I think it largely depends on, skill sets, right? And because I think a lot of, we kind of were talking about, a lot of different things and how containers don't excite you, but, for some people, containers are pretty exciting because maybe they're not as, say, sophisticated as a developer as you are, right? And so they allow a lot of things to occur that they traditionally would not be able to do, right? And so we have to look at the developer skill set when you're looking at actually what you're going to be using. Now, from a systems perspective, what we have is a lot of folks that we're used to kind of like command line interface or, like server administrators, things like that. They're really excited because they can take, like I was saying, like network functions that are becoming virtualized and put them in a container, and they don't have to worry about, being stuck to VMware or being stuck to, another sort of, vendor. They can actually move their applications across multiple different environments. When before they were, tightly coupled. Now that loosely coupled is coming in, and you're seeing that abstraction, right? And I think that's really important. And I think that this is important to address too. As I look at PaaS and the way that that's affecting, kind of the stack as a whole. These stacks are flattening, right? So you have kind of like your app server and up flattened to be kind of like a platform as a service. You've got your infrastructure flatten, your server, storage, and compute, right, to be infrastructure as a service now. So you have to look at, when you're looking at PaaS and infrastructure as a service, do you want those tightly coupled or more loosely coupled?
So Craig, thoughts? I mean, as the, creator of Kubernetes, did that change, or, containers change the way that sort of you view the building blocks of how we build applications, or was that, just continuation of a trend?
Yeah, no, I think it has fundamentally changed the way that people experience and consume software. I mean, I look back on my experience. So I did Compute Engine before we did Container Engine, and it was pretty jarring. The sort of the difference in experiences between someone who's coming into this VM-based product. So we were very proud. We were a young team, just got our first production users, and we started looking at what people were doing with it. And it just didn't make any sense because we were Google guys. Like everything is in containers at Google, right? Like everything was there.
Yeah.
We looked at the efficiency levels that folks were getting out of these out of the VM-based offerings. We looked at the atom of deployment, the set of tools they were using, and it looked nothing like what we were used to. I think that one of the things that this container revolution is bringing to bear is it's changing the basic atom of software consumption. It's really redefining it as this much more lightweight, portable unit or atom that is much easier to manage and has much higher levels of introspectability.
Yeah.
If you think about the world of VMs today, like as the guy who sort of was building out Compute Engine, like we couldn't see very much. You see x86 instruction set and paravirtualized device driver calls. It's not very sort of enlightened sort of line of sort of integration. Whereas with containers, you have the full Cisco interface. You offer much higher levels of insight. It offers far more portability, far more manageability, and it really is a gateway to dynamic management and dynamic systems. And I think that's, to me personally, the most exciting thing about this. We've been doing it for years inside Google, and now we're able to really start seeing ways that people outside of Google can run these much more enlightened applications as a result of this new atom of software deployment and consumption.
Interesting. Sam?
So looking at it from the developer down, from the app developer down, rather than from the systems engineer or the sysadmin up, containers are nice for separating the concerns of modern applications, right? You need a place to put all of your stateless code that you're going to do your fire hose type I/O with, and then you've got services which are not going to be in your container. They're going to be system level services that you can depend on. Where's my Redis, right? Where's my network interface? What are the other things that I need to rely on? Some of the feedback that I've heard in the last month, it's actually exactly 28 days in my new job, so it's important to listen. The things that I keep hearing are, where's my SLA for the services below the container level?
Mm-hmm.
We know that we need to depend on storage, on image transformation, on all sorts of things that we don't want to deal with. So for me, the big revolution is microservices. The idea that as an app developer, you're now having a consistent concentric ring approach to architecture. Containers are one of a number of technologies that make it much, much nicer to build microservices. Know you'll have a stable environment and know that you can depend on the systems engineers and those who are implementing a lot of this hard stuff, right? The PaaS and infrastructure layers, to know that you'll have a reliable fabric to deploy on, right? So I want elasticity as a developer.
Yep.
This is sort of there's an ecosystem here of ideas and technologies that are starting to make that work.
Yeah. Steve? Anything?
Again, I have to go last.
You're going first next. So.
Okay. Oh, great. So I think so as much as I poo-pooed containers, I wasn't really meaning to poo-poo containers. What I really was trying to say is...
What I meant, Your Majesty, was...
What?
What I meant, Your Majesty, was...
Yeah, what I meant. I think containers are actually pretty awesome when they're combined with other technology, right? So that's the part that's exciting for me. And Steve, you actually brought this up once on an analyst call where we were talking about OpenShift, and you're like, it's nothing like my... you were comparing it to... It's not like my hosted Linux thing, and this is a big hurdle for me. And so this is back to what you were saying. I think a lot of developers, when they came to Google App Engine or when they come to a PaaS and to start with, they think of, I have a VM or I have a machine and I need to develop that same way. And I think there is a mind shift, and then containers make it nicer and easier to make that mind shift where you can just give a command and have your whole infrastructure up. It costs me nothing in terms of, like, to spin up EAP, JBoss EAP for me is one command. I don't have to play with any configuration files. I don't have to play with any XML. And if I want, my sysadmin can set it up exactly the way our company sets it up. So what it frees me is I don't have to be a DevOps anymore. I can just be dev. And I can spin up things quickly and fast and say, I want to try Node. Okay, there's Node. Oh, that really sucked. Delete it, and it's gone. So there's this agility that I get, and that ties right into the microservices thing, where now I can say, I want 6 copies of Redis running. Go. And it just does it. Like before, that would have been like, forget it. Just forget it. I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have taken the cost to get up that hill unless I had a whole bunch of other Linux people with me. Would have been, I'm just not doing Redis. Back to MySQL and Tomcat. And here I get to experiment and play and build really interesting things because containers are so lightweight, so easy to spin up, and so easy to destroy.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great time to be an app
Well, you
developer.
may have answered the next question, but we'll see.
Okay,
So,
that's
Ram's
how
here
good
to
I
talk, containers, PaaS, and the future of application development. So, with either containers, PaaS, or both, as far as sort of, your experience certainly as a developer today, talking to developers, what's the single most important thing that either or both of those has changed in terms of developing applications moving forward?
So
you wanted to go first.
I know. I also wanted. I had lots of time to think before.
Yeah,
now I have to I would think that actually, I think PaaS, the idea, and PaaS has had the biggest impact, right? I don't think containers has I think PaaS has had the biggest impact because it's allowed developers to stop thinking about how am I going to install this, how am I going to get this running. It's made a very clear line of separation. Like my therapist says, if you've seen any of my talks, like my therapist says, clear boundaries, infinite possibilities, right? And so, yeah. So, but if you stop, some more deep introspection. So if you but if you actually
We wanted to inspect the objects, not you.
yeah. So I think though that if you think about, at first I was like, what are you talking about? That sounds like no relationship at all, and any relationship. She was saying this about any relationship. And if you think about it though, if we have very clearly delineated boundaries, then I know I'm on this side and I can do anything I want on this side and I don't have to go to you every single time. And the way we do app development without this kind of stuff now is, well, I kind of do some sysadmin stuff and, oh, sysadmin, I need to change this config file. I know you didn't set that up. And then, so there's just all this back and forth between the developer and the sysadmin and they have to wear too many hats.
Right.
This way I can say, the sysadmins can set up all the containers for me. I can just use the PaaS to get access to my containers and spin up the architecture in the way that I want in an approved manner. And not have to get, so I think, and I say this in all my talks, if you're an application developer, if you work with them, they should be playing with PaaS now. Given the suite of customers that Red Hat has that are buying our product, that Cloud Foundry has, that all the PaaSes have buying their product, they're big, large enterprises. And they're coming to us saying, when are you coming out with the Docker version? I need the Docker version. And so I think you are doing your developers a disservice if they're not playing with a PaaS.
And there's a reason for that. So when we talk about the future of application development, I think the most interesting thing is that every enterprise is becoming a software company, right? So everybody's heard Andreessen's software is eating the world. You could take that a step further and say if you're not available in the cloud, right? If you don't have APIs, if you can't be connected to, you don't exist. Like not having a website in 1995. So the volume of new app development that has to be done is unprecedented, and we are never going to have enough app developers to meet all the demand, right? The demand is exploding. There's always going to be a limited supply of systems engineers and sysadmins. We're going to have more and more app developers who have less and less time to write more and more code. So the more that we can simplify their life, the better off we are. So the future of application development is at the enterprise boundary, not just all the junk apps that you have to run HR internally, but the definition of does the enterprise exist or not is going to be defined by did an app developer write that service and make it available.
Well,
so that's I think where the
to
focus
add, I
needs to
think
go.
to what Sam to what Sam said, just really looking at how people build today too, right? Like people aren't really building applications from scratch as much as they were in the past. They're assembling these applications, and PaaS provides that kind of safe sandbox environment with the tools that are required to actually build that up, whether it be from scratch or whether it be, from a set of, code that they pulled from GitHub or something, something along those lines. I think that looking at the number of developers that are actually building versus the number that are assembling, you're looking at massively different skill sets, right? And so being able to have PaaS environments with, multiple choices for language, like you were saying, oh, Node, I don't want to use that, let's throw it away, let's go back to what I know, right? Like the ability to do that is just phenomenal.
So Craig, most important thing for the future of application development?
I think the folks have been touching on it pretty well here. We're going to see this specialization of the operations function, and I think that's an incredibly important and powerful thing. So you're going to have a small number of specialized people that exist in an environment that provide, infrastructure, provisioning, a set of, a clustered environment, a set of common services, the set of things that the everyday developer needs to do their work. And those are going to be specialized functions, and they're going to be people that understand the systems and they curate and manage the systems. They're going to be few, and they're going to be effective. They're going to have great tools. And then I think we're just going to start to see a much stronger alignment of the individual technologists with the business. And I think a lot of what we're doing here and a lot of these capabilities and technologies are going to kind of reduce the tyranny of centralized IT. So you can actually have tools where it's safe for a technologist to be embedded in a business department. They're able to start from a safe foundation of technology that's provided by a set of core folks. And they can work much more quickly and much more efficiently, and perhaps even be far less specialized in terms of their skill set, because you have these other technologies behind the scene that are creating this common environment, these common services, these common capabilities. And then we're going to start to see a much stronger set of overlay technologies that exist on top of this, because everything's running in these very introspectable, principled, controllable atoms that lets things that have to be centralized, like governance, risk management, compliance, et cetera, be centralized. And I think this is really going to be pulled together by the container technologies. I can't personally separate container and PaaS anymore. Like it's almost a nonsensical separation. PaaS was always container-based. What we just have is more principled technologies that are more accessible these days. Yeah. And I think that sort of separation and specialization is going to be a very powerful thing for the business.
Okay. So can I give one example of that?
No, but you're going to get the next question.
Oh, but it was a great example. It was an eye-opening experience.
I'm sure.
I'm going to tie it into my question no matter how.
Okay. Good job. So one of the things Sam mentioned this earlier in terms of these the Venn diagrams. We were talking about sort of to Craig's point in terms of hey, is there a distinction between PaaS and containers? One of the things that we get questions about all the time, right, are not just containers and PaaS, but we start looking at things like Mesos, the infrastructure as a service pieces that underlie most of this. There are a lot of moving pieces here, right? So the question for you, sir, is when when you're out talking to customers, what is your sort of assessment of how well they're digesting what all the pieces are and how they put them together correctly to get where they need to go?
I'm not going to tie in my other part.
I didn't think you would.
Okay, so I think one of the things that I've seen most with customers is nobody's at the same place. I mean, and that's pretty simple to say, but what that means is I think anyone who says this is the way you have to do it is selling you something, and not in a good way. And because some people say, like, even we get people, like, can't you use Ansible and Chef to do what your PaaS does? And I go, yeah, you could probably pretty much do the same thing. I mean, it takes more work and it's more customization, but there's many different ways to get to this same point.
Right.
And I think some of it is people are excited and scared about the cloud at the same time, right? Because it's a completely new way of doing things.
Yep.
So if we were to go in, or if I were to go in and say, yeah, keep your hard machines, but then scrap all the individual OSs, and you should put OpenStack and then OpenShift on top of that, and that's the only proper way to run. I think I'd be doing them a great disservice, because they'd take them a long time, unless they were already in that spot. Like, we're ready for infrastructure as a service, and we're ready for PaaS. Great, here's the products we have for you. But sometimes with some customers, it's like, well, start with OpenShift. Right? You guys are doing a lot of application development, and this can just run anywhere that RHEL's running. So you already have some RHEL machines, just throw it on there and see how that works for your company. So and then whenever I ask developers, it shows, how many of you know what infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service is? I don't have the nice graphs that James has, because I don't have a straight feed out of my head. But I would say the graph looks something, in terms of those who actually know the distinction, it looks something like we still have a long way to go.
Well, the distinction's going to become less and less material.
But
right?
see, I think, okay, so Laura and I had a Twitter battle over this the other day. I actually think the distinction between infrastructure as a service and the platform as a service, and I don't think platform as a service is a nonsensical term, first. And then second, I actually think it's a very good distinction, because it actually sets up that clear line of separation that you were talking about before. Infrastructure as a service to me is you deal with infrastructure. Like, you are dealing with provisioning machines and all that kind of stuff. And platform as a service, I'm an application developer. I don't want to think about the machines. Maybe from the application developer's perspective, it is a big distinction. Maybe from the company's perspective, it's not. But as an application developer, I don't want to work with infrastructure as a service. That gets me right back into, I have to admin Linux machines.
I see it as an artificial dichotomy. Can I
go ahead.
next?
Yeah.
My turn to disagree with you.
Good.
So I see this as a pretty artificial dichotomy, and the reality of most real-world deployments I see is they don't fit nicely into either. And
exactly.
I'm sort of involved in the evolution of App Engine, which is a traditional PaaS. I'm involved in the evolution of Compute Engine and everything in between. And a lot of our customers, they hit this artificial cliff with a PaaS. So it's the way that people have defined PaaS to date. It offers you trade off flexibility for opinionation, and it works very well to a certain point, and then suddenly you hit this experiential cliff, and you tend to have to do something else. And the problem with that, I tend to think about this, and my experience with it has been it's like a little hole in a water balloon, right? The minute you have this artificial cliff that exists between the platform and the infrastructure pieces, you're forcing the developers to step outside of the PaaS and do something else. And while it might still be easier to do in the PaaS, they have to invest in an infrastructure provisioning story, Puppet or Chef or Ansible or SaltStack to actually do the management. They have to start dealing with that. And eventually they're like, well, why would I do this when I can just do this? And so I think it's really important to start thinking about a more natural continuum that exists between these. You do have infrastructure as a service, and you do have people that have VMs, and you have folks that are always going to have this highly optimized kernel something to support the specific workload that they want to run in this appliance-like environment. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people that just want to run my code. But I do think that there are some intermediate steps that are worth recognizing. I think of the cluster as a first-class thing. I think there's this world where you go from infrastructure ops to cluster ops, where you don't necessarily have the fully curated story, but you have a clustered environment and a set of common services, and it's sort of the first step into the logical computing domain. And I think that it's dangerous to try to draw an artificial line between the two, because there are situations where what I really want to do is I want to run precisely one container on one machine, and I don't want you to tell me what development environment I need to run. I don't want you to tell me what storage it backs onto. And so I think it is an artificial dichotomy. I think what you're going to start seeing as these technologies evolve is a series of paths through the stack, rather than a set of sort of striated layers. So I can use this, or I can use this, or I can use this, or I can use this, and I can use them all together using a sort of common set of principles that tie it all together. And I think it's going to be really interesting.
But wait, so what are you when you say
Well,
I'm getting?
hang on, let's Lauren.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what we're arguing about.
Not much, really. There's got to be a little sauce.
I can't help you there.
What we were arguing about? We were arguing about whether PaaS was a nonsensical term or not.
I don't think we were.
There was some
I'll tell you what, you could Twitter battle that
after the panel.
How's
You
that?
got it. I'm not going to
So
go
I think just kind of to chime in, I think that this sets a perfect example right here. Both of you guys, kind of providing both of your perspectives. I mean, the technology is evolving. I think that, what you're talking about is totally feasible, right? But the organizations have to catch up. A lot of times what I find walking into customers is that I work with one group of customers in a large enterprise company, and then I work with another group of customers in the same enterprise company, right? And they sit inside different departments. And they want to use, one wants to use one sort of, PaaS platform, another wants to use another one, and that's great. That's fine by me. It's really what the skill set, what they want in that box, in that container with those tools, right? To make them successful. My job's to enable that, right? I think that organizationally we have to start looking at, as we were talking about how technology is going to transform, and there's these more kind of pod-like structures that are tied together with, specific parameters, yet they all kind of fit together. We're not there as an organization yet. Organizations aren't there, period. And there are massive silos across the board when you look at, networking and storage and compute and, then up the stack to app dev, even in app dev, and then where does security fit in, right? I mean, it's not just like, oh, I can use a PaaS platform and it's magic, right? There's all this underlying stuff that has to go into it, and people don't recognize that.
Which leads us actually to, I think the next question, which is one I'm actually very curious to hear the responses on, because we all spend so much time, whether it's infrastructure or platforms or containers and sort of all these wonderful things, particularly given the days when I was developing things, life's a lot easier, right? You have way more tools that, sort of available to you, the huge library of open source code, the infrastructure, and so on and so forth, so life's great. But on the flip side, there are still some frustrations, right? There's still some things that don't necessarily, work the way that you want. So like when you guys project forward, as you look at the application development experience, what's sort of most frustrating for you? You know, what's the piece where you're still focused on this just is not where I want it to be, and we need to move that ball forward?
So in many ways, my first programming job was the easiest and most satisfying because I had an environment where I could hit F5 and it ran. Right, it was local on my box. There wasn't the whole, oh, it works on my machine. Yeah. Right, it was just very simple. So as we get these very large scale problems, how do you do application development and deployment in the data center? Not really a problem that most developers have, right? You care about design, you care about affordances, you care about modeling the problem domain correctly, appropriate representation of the user's concerns. Matching that into the data center is kind of rough. So things like Lattice is a new project within the Cloud Foundry umbrella to say, how do we solve this problem down to a small scale so that you have the equivalent of deploying to a data center, but it's just right on your laptop, I think Steve was saying. Yep. Similar things happening in OpenShift. It's just logical because you got to take these galactic scale problems and solve them on your desktop. That's probably the biggest gap, and it's been the most painful part of, frankly, internet development since the late 90s. So hopefully that's starting to get solved.
I'd say that's very fair. Lauren, what's the biggest issue you see?
I think the one that I see is when you're taking things like PaaS and infrastructure as a service, right? The ability to, let's say you're building an application and it's not giving you the optimal performance that you want. It's actually the visibility down to the layer that you need to get it down to in order to tweak that, those 3 lines of code or whatever on your website. That could be, something that's actually happening in a router, right? In terms of, the effectiveness, and it's affecting the speed of your website. When you get to the large scale websites, that's millions and millions of dollars per millisecond, right? And so you want that to run. The lack of that visibility is definitely a problem that I see across the board, and the inability of application developers to have access to that or even speak the same language as network administrators to even fix those problems. It's a huge gap, and technology has to bridge that gap. It's not a people problem. It needs to be fixed by technology.
Okay.
So I'm torn. There's 2 things I really want to talk about. The one challenge that endlessly frustrates me is this dichotomy. This is just personal, but the dichotomy that exists between the world inside Google and the world outside Google. The world inside Google has moon lasers and insane technology that's incredibly complicated and hard to use. Like it's phenomenally powerful. It's spectacularly awesome. The world outside Google is a relatively simple set of tools that are much easier to use. And so the thing that's kind of endlessly interesting and intriguing to me is to try to bring those 2 worlds together, like create moon laser, self-regulating, AI-driven management experiences in a world that's accessible to the outside. The thing I actually wanted to say that was going to be my actual answer here is it's so hard to reuse software in a reliable, trustworthy way. It's so easy to find something, and it's almost impossible to know where it came from. And it's just endlessly frustrating. Like, we have to do a better job with provenance and attestation stuff. Like, we just have to do it.
So for me, containers are the thing that are frustrating. No, just kidding. What it actually is the paradox of choice, I would say. Okay. So I've started building microservice apps now. So first, it would have been Sam's stuff, but Sam said it first. So I'm going to do an addendum. And the addendum is, it's the paradox of choice stuff, which is, I've started making microservices apps. Great, I get this. How do I wire this together? What's the best practices? I've got all these little microservices. Where are all my log files going? How do I monitor this? How do I load test this? And then the other thing is just exactly what you said. You go on Docker Hub, you search for WordPress. How many different Docker images do you get? And which one is the right one to use? And it's the same problem I always had with AMIs. I put in an AMI, how do I know what, like the whole curate, it's keeping all these incredibly moving things and yes, as a developer now, my job is to understand which are the blessed images and the blessed architectures and these things that no one's really solved yet in a distributed space at a smaller scale. So it's great when Facebook and Google get up and talk about how they solve these things, but for most developers, their scale's not Google and Facebook, and the level of engineering talent and numbers that they have are not the same. So I can't just say, hey, I'll take 5 people off of this team and build a distributed logging system. It's different.
Right.
But even then, right, the myth of isolation, right, creeps in. Oh, we can use services that are just in our own enterprise. oh, baloney, right? You're going to use some services that come off of Dropbox, some will come off of other parts of the public internet. So I think we can all agree distributed debugging is a disaster. It's always been a disaster. Does it always have to be a disaster? We don't know, right? There was, one day Zarathustra spoke, and then we had dtrace. Thank goodness. Yeah. But now in a world of APIs and microservices and all that, pity the poor developer. We have to do a lot better for debugging tools so that it's less disastrous.
Yeah, no argument.
And put WebSockets on top of that, right? So start with WebSockets and then go to a distributed app underneath the whole thing. It's just
it's been interesting because it's one of those we talk to audiences and people assume because the the cloud has grown so rapidly that the development experience is great. You're like, you actually tried to develop an application? Mm-hmm. It's much harder than it needs to be. The tooling, I would certainly agree is not there, nor is the debugging experience. We are running out of time, so last question for the panel. And I guess I'll start with Steve, since he likes being first.
I want to be first in everything.
So the question is this. We have a bunch of folks in the room, obviously, that are sort of interested and committed to advocate for open source. So when we look at future development, future PaaS, containers, and so on, what role does open source play there?
Okay, so this one's kind of an easy one. It is only open source. I mean, if you look, except for Heroku, but I think that's because they got first mover advantage. And they also benefited from all the open source that was there. Ever since Heroku, it's been there is nothing that I can think of in our ecosystem right now. Can you name?
Apprenda.
Mm-hmm. Who? I know who Apprenda is, but their market share and the amount of traction they have they like to pretend, but anyway, that was my being kind of nasty and catty. But basically,
Your Majesty is like a jelly donut. Discuss.
Other than Apprenda and Staccato, those are the two, but even Staccato is based off of Foundry. Yeah. I mean, there is, like you said before, because of the economies of scale here, it has to be open source because of in our next version, we're just using Kubernetes, right? So we're going to use containers, either Docker or Rocket, whichever container comes around, and then we're using Kubernetes, and then we're putting an open source layer on top of that. I don't see how this ecosystem can exist without open source.
Greg, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree. And I think, as a cloud provider, I got through Container Compute Engine, which was our sort of proprietary VM offering, and was figuring out what to do next. And it was kind of a non-obvious choice to lead a cloud service as an open source initiative. And it took a little convincing internally, but I'm so glad I did. I mean, the velocity, the power, the breadth, our ability to engage a partner ecosystem like the wonderful people at Red Hat that contribute literally as much to Kubernetes as we do. Our friends at CoreOS, our friends at Docker, we could not do that in a proprietary software way. I think anyone who's trying to build a mainstream service or a mainstream product as proprietary is going to be at a massive competitive disadvantage to the open source community. Mm-hmm. It's a simple factor of economics and agility.
Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's said. I mean, I think that, when you look at kind of, open source is absolutely critical, but we have to talk about interoperability with existing systems too, right? We can't leave that out. So interoperability with those systems is going to be extremely important with open source to make sure that there's the right, plugins or drivers or things like that can enable, applications to run across multiple different environments and also support multiple PaaS platforms.
Fair enough. Sam, last word?
So one of the reasons that interstellar space travel is science fiction is not just because the technologies haven't been invented yet, but because it's going to require so many resources that you have to have a global government. Somehow all of us have to get along. PaaS and data center operating systems are so complicated that no one company can build it. So the economics just push us to have it be the equivalent of the International Space Station, right? It's got to be many, many companies working together. They've all got to put their best stuff in the pot. They've all got to trust that somehow it's all going to work out for them, and if not in this recombination, then in the next one. So,
yeah, now I'm pissed I didn't think of that analogy for my slides this morning. But
it has to be open.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. If you'd join me in giving the panelists a hand.